Okay, so we're diving straight in today with some brand new declassified documents about the JFK assassination. And this batch was just released this past March in 2025.
Wow.
Yeah, so hot off the presses for you listening, which means, well, this is as new for us as it is for you, so we're going to try to pull out some of the most interesting stuff together.
Right off the bat, these are all materials from the early to mid-1960s, mostly memoranda and cables from what I've seen.
Yeah, exactly the type of stuff we love to dig into here.
Absolutely. So we're going to be focusing on specific details and potential connections within these records, trying to see what new insights they might offer.
Okay, let's do it. One of the first things that jumped out at me was this memorandum dated June 1st, 1964.
Okay.
It's about a conversation regarding the Warren Commission's investigation into Lee Harvey Oswald's stay in Helsinki.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, back in October 1959, apparently there was this guy, Frank Freiberg, and he gave some pretty specific information. So what do you think that tells us about how the commission was approaching this, digging into these details from years earlier?
Well, I think what's really fascinating here is the level of detail that they were going into. Even years after the assassination, they were trying to reconstruct Oswald's movements very, very carefully.
Right.
So Freiberg, he provided a lot of logistical details. Like, for instance, he noted that a drive from the airport to downtown Helsinki would take about 25 minutes.
Okay.
And crucially, he estimated that a taxi could reach the Soviet consulate in no more than 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Wow.
Yeah, so think about that for a second, right? That close proximity to the Soviet consulate certainly raises questions about, the potential ease of access that Oswald might have had.
Yeah, it does kind of make you wonder what he was doing there.
It's there.
Freiberg also mentioned that the Soviet consulate likely closed at 1 p.m. local time on Saturdays back in 1959.
Interesting.
Yeah, it seems like the commission was really trying to establish a very precise timeline of Oswald's, activities, potential contacts.
Down to the hour.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Every moment, every possible interaction, they were looking at it all under a microscope.
Makes you wonder what else they might have found, right?
Definitely.
Freiberg, he also provided information regarding the U.S. consulate in Helsinki. He stated that passenger lists were only retained for 6 months before being destroyed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he noted that a CIA official, Mr. Robert Fulton, was stationed there at the time.
So, for you listening, that little detail about the records being destroyed really highlights how challenging these historical investigations can be, right? Sometimes those pieces of the puzzle are just gone.
Yeah, unfortunately lost to time.
It does kind of make you wonder what might have been learned if those records were still around, though, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Freiberg also said that if the State Department sent a cable inquiry, a copy would go to the Helsinki station, and that they would assist in preparing a response.
Interesting.
He actually felt that it would be valuable to send a separate cable to the station, kind of going beyond what the State Department was asking. And he even suggested some changes. So what do you think that tells us about the information gathering process at the time?
Well, I think it suggests that they were taking a multi-layered approach. They wanted to go beyond just the official channels probe, a little deeper, maybe uncover some details that might have been overlooked in those initial inquiries.
Right, like they're being very proactive.
Absolutely. They were determined to find out everything they could.
Okay, let's move on to another document. This one is dated July 9, 1964.
Okay.
It's a memorandum detailing a discussion with Mr. W. David Slauson from the Warren Commission staff.
Interesting.
So the purpose of this meeting was to address some apparent inconsistencies between information coming from the CIA and the Department of State.
Oh, that's interesting. Conflicting information, huh?
Yeah, and it was prompted by a letter from Mr. Richard Helms, the CIA director.
Right, right.
What do you think this reveals about the challenges that the commission was facing, trying to get to the bottom of things?
Well, it shows just how complex this whole thing was, right? You've got different government agencies, each with their own sources, their own perspectives, and trying to piece all that together must have been a nightmare.
Yeah, like a giant puzzle with some of the pieces missing.
Exactly.
So the discussion with Mr. Slauson focused on the legality and the typical procedures for Soviet citizens emigrating to the Soviet Union to join their spouses, whether they could leave together at the same time.
I see. And this was likely related to Marina Oswald's case, right?
Yes, exactly. It seems like they were trying to understand those standard processes and timelines to kind of gauge whether Marina Oswald's situation was normal or not.
Right, right.
The memo mentions a review of 26 cases where foreign nationals married Soviet citizens in the USSR, 10 of which involved Americans.
And what did they find?
Well, the findings are pretty interesting. In only 3 of those 26 cases did the Soviet wife leave the Soviet Union with her husband at the same time.
So it was very uncommon.
Yeah. It seems so. And then in two other instances, the American men actually met and married their wives during visits to the USSR, and then later brought them to the U.S.
Okay.
And there was a fourth case involving a Swedish student, but the details for that one weren't available.
Hmm.
So what do you think all of this tells us about the challenges these couples faced?
Well, it definitely paints a picture of just how difficult it was for these couples to be together, right? Simultaneous departure was extremely rare, and there were significant hurdles that they had to overcome.
Yeah, it really underscores those difficulties.
Yeah, absolutely.
The discussion then turned to the amount of time it took Soviet authorities to process visa applications for Soviet wives of American citizens.
Okay.
And they referenced the letter from Mr. Meeker and another memo from April 1964. And the timelines across these 26 cases were all over the place.
So it wasn't consistent?
No, not at all. The memo says that in 11 cases, the time frame was pretty clear, but in 3 cases, it took 5 to 9 months for the visa to be issued.
Wow.
And in 2 more, it was about 6 months. And then in 3 other cases, it took a minimum of 7, 11, and 12 months.
That's a huge range.
Yeah, right. So it seems like the process was very unpredictable.
You can imagine the frustration for the people involved.
Absolutely. And this is where those inconsistencies between the CIA and the State Department come in.
Right, you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, so the memo points out the statistics regarding Soviet visa processing didn't quite match up between the two agencies.
Why do you think that was?
Well, it suggests that maybe they were using different methods to gather and analyze information.
So even within the government, there wasn't a unified picture.
Yeah, it seems that way, and it just goes to show how difficult it is to get a completely accurate picture of what was really going on.
Especially when you're dealing with multiple sources like this.
Exactly. And it also shows that the Warren Commission was trying its best to reconcile these differences to get the most accurate understanding possible.
Right, they had a tough job for sure.
Okay, so now we come to a section titled Miscellaneous Notes on Soviets Married to Foreigners.
Okay, this sounds interesting.
Yeah, it is. It offers some fascinating individual stories, and it really humanizes those bureaucratic complexities that we've been talking about.
Right, because behind all those statistics, there are real people with real lives.
Exactly. So, for example, we have Adele and Zizlovsky, and her husband actually hired this international lawyer to try to help them get out of the USSR.
Wow, so they were really desperate to leave.
Yeah, it seems so. And then there's Leonard Kirsch, whose Soviet wife eventually made it to the USA, and there's also a mention of Joseph J. Fondam's contact in Moscow.
So a mix of successes and ongoing struggles.
Yeah, exactly. And it really highlights the personal struggles and the lengths that people had to go to just to be with the ones they loved.
Absolutely. It's heartbreaking in some cases.
The notes also mention Edgar Lehrman, a U.S. exchange student who married Ruth Marikova at Moscow University.
And there was some suspicion surrounding her activities, right?
Yeah, it seems like there were questions about her motives.
Interesting.
Then there's Nils Thalen, a Swedish exchange student who had a lot of trouble bringing his Russian wife out of the country.
So this wasn't just an issue for Americans.
No, not at all. For you listening, these examples show that it was a widespread problem, and it must have created a lot of anxiety for everyone involved.
Mhm. Yeah, you can only imagine the stress and uncertainty.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't limited to just those cases. Either Kurt Johansson, a Swedish intelligence course student, married Tamara Serebrennikova, who is a TASS journalist, and they also faced obstacles.
Wow.
Yeah, and then there's Gunnar Nordenstam, another Swedish exchange student who married Natalia Korshinskaya, and the case of John Sandor and Victoria Kucherkova is particularly interesting.
What happened there?
Well, he actually had to leave the USSR before they could even get married.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so these stories, they really show you the restrictions that were placed on personal freedom during this time.
Right, and it's interesting how often intelligence agencies, particularly the KGB, come up in these marriage scenarios.
Yeah, it creates this sense of paranoia and distrust.
It does, doesn't it? It makes you realize just how controlled the environment was.
Yeah, it was a very different world back then.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. There's this note about a name check and consolidation request for a Roman Fedorovich Dedkov and his wife, Vilasa Nikolaevna Dedkov. They were listed as applicants for entry visas to India sometime before April 1952. And what's interesting is that Dedkov was scheduled to arrive in New Delhi on September 17, 1960, for a 2-year stint as an English language teacher at the Soviet embassy.
So this was a few years before the assassination.
Yeah, but these records often have information about people who might have crossed paths with Oswald or had other connections that could be relevant even if it's not directly related to the assassination.
Right. It helps to paint a broader picture of what was going on at the time.
Exactly. And the note also says that it's unknown whether Dedkov actually made it to New Delhi.
Another mystery.
Yeah, it is. It makes you wonder if there are any hidden links or relationships that we might be missing.
It's a reminder that we only have a partial view of the past.
Right. There are always more pieces to the puzzle.
And sometimes those missing pieces can be the most intriguing.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on, we have a dispatch from December 24, 1964, and this one is about selected excerpts of Warren Commission testimony. And this information was sent to various CIA stations around the world. So what do you think that tells us about how interested people were in the Commission's findings?
Well, it shows that they were taking it very seriously. Even after the official report was published, they wanted to make sure that everyone was on the same page.
Right, and the dispatch highlights the Commission's focus on the magnitude of the problem involved in presidential protection and the service's support responsibilities.
So they were really concerned about security in the wake of the assassination.
Yeah, absolutely. And it mentions that attached were the actual testimonies given before the Warren Commission by U.S. intelligence and security officials.
Wow, so they had access to the primary source material.
Yeah, it must have been really valuable for those CIA stations to get that kind of firsthand insight.
For sure, it gives you a much deeper understanding of how they reached their conclusions.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move on to a document from a little bit later. This one's from July 3, 1974.
Okay.
It's a memorandum regarding OTS, late TSD, and Jim McCord's Cuban activities.
Jim McCord from the Watergate scandal.
That's the one.
So what's the connection here?
Well, it seems like they were looking into McCord's past to see if there were any links to Cuban operations that might shed light on his actions during Watergate.
So basically digging into his background.
Exactly. They wanted to know everything they could about him.
And according to the memo, Ben Colling was contacted about this, and he said that one of the guys who had been imprisoned in Cuba had asked about McCord's involvement, but couldn't find any evidence of it.
Interesting.
Yeah, and none of the other OTS personnel that Colling spoke with could remember McCord being involved either.
So it sounds like they were trying to rule out any connections.
Yeah, it seems that way. And just to clarify for you listening, OTS later became TSD, which is the CIA's Technical Services Division.
Right, right.
So the memo suggests that even if McCord had been involved, his role was probably limited to planning at headquarters and didn't involve any actual operations in Cuba.
So nothing on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. And what I find interesting is that they were still looking into this years later.
It shows how thorough they were. They didn't want to leave any stone unturned.
Right, and there's this really fascinating detail in the memo. It mentions that the security personnel within TSD had the responsibility of hand-holding with the families of 3 men involved in a particular operation.
Hand-holding, what does that mean?
Well, basically it means providing support and keeping them informed.
Oh, okay.
And the source suggests that there might be TSD records related to this that could lead to someone who knows something about McCord's involvement, even if it was indirect.
So another potential lead.
Yeah, and get this, Colling was pulled out of a staff meeting to talk about this, and he said he would call back later.
So it was clearly a sensitive matter.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so for our final document, we have a memorandum from September 20, 1966, which summarizes a Steskit audio operation against the New China News Agency in Havana.
This sounds completely different.
Yeah, it is. It shifts our focus away from Oswald and toward some of the covert intelligence operations that were happening in Cuba during this period.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So the memo details how this operation got started. It began in May 1959 when they established an office in the El Medico building.
And this was for intelligence gathering.
On the surface, it was for business purposes, but it also had some residential apartments.
Ah, so a good cover.
Exactly. And the station got permission from Ambassador Bonsall and an embassy employee named Miss Carolyn E. Stacy to set up an audio surveillance operation targeting the apartment next door, which was occupied by the New China News Agency.
So they were listening in on the Chinese.
Yeah, they were. And the FE division, which is the Far East division within the CIA, sent a case officer and a TSD technician to Havana in November 1959 to install the equipment in Miss Stacy's apartment.
Wow, that's pretty brazen.
It is, isn't it? It shows how far they were willing to go to gather intelligence during the Cold War.
For sure, it was a different time.
So they were literally listening through the walls. But then the New China News Agency started using additional rooms, and there were problems with the communication equipment.
So they had to adapt.
Yeah, they did. They ended up needing a 3-person TSD team to handle everything. And when the New China News Agency threatened to break their lease, the station had to install transmitters and switches to keep monitoring remotely.
Or they were determined to keep listening.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive how resourceful and persistent they were.
It shows their commitment to the operation.
Absolutely. But in September 1966, 3 technicians were arrested by Cuban authorities.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was a major setback. 2 of them were later debriefed and released, but the third one remained in custody, and they couldn't get in touch with him.
That's worrying.
Yeah, and the memo says that the 3 technicians had traveled to Cuba as tourists.
So they were undercover.
Yeah, which just adds another layer of complexity to all of this.
It was a risky business for sure.
Absolutely. So this Estes operation, it really highlights the intelligence battles that were being fought during the Cold War.
And the risks that people are taking.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that while these operations might not be directly tied to the JFK assassination, they do give us some valuable context about the broader intelligence landscape at the time.
Absolutely. It helps us to understand the world that Oswald was operating in.
Right. So as we wrap up this deep dive into these newly declassified documents.
From March 2025.
Yeah, from March 2025, it's clear that we've uncovered a lot of different information. From the specifics of Oswald's time in Helsinki to the challenges of marrying across the Iron Curtain and even those covert audio surveillance operations in Cuba.
Right, and these files offer a fascinating glimpse into a pivotal moment in history.
They do, and it's important to remember that this is just a small sample of the materials that were released.
There's a lot more out there to explore.
Absolutely. So for you listening, what aspects of the JFK assassination era do you find most compelling or still unanswered? We encourage you to do your own research and think critically about these events, especially now that we have access to this new information.
It's an opportunity to revisit the past with fresh eyes.
Exactly. And who knows what else we might discover as more and more documents become declassified.
The truth is out there.
Maybe so.
Maybe so.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
See you then.